Welcome to ArchiTreats Food for Thought, sponsored by Friends of the Alabama Archives. Remember to please turn off or silence cell phones before the program begins. And we invite you to plan now to join us for ArchiTreats next month. We have two engaging programs. On Thursday, July 8th, historian Mary Neely will talk about her book on Matthew Blue, Montgomery's First Historian. New South Books will have books available for purchase. On Thursday, July 15th, Ruth Cook will present The Magic of Marble, Silicaga's Landmark. Today's speaker received an MA in Anthropology from the University of Alabama. Her research focuses on prehistoric and early historic textiles from the southeastern region of North America. She is currently responsible for the research, design, and production of prehistoric and early historic costumes for the University of South Alabama. Prior to her research on prehistoric textiles, she worked at the phone company for 18 years and in computers. She was associate editor and a frequent contributor to Spinoff, a national magazine for hand spinners. Please welcome Mary Spanos.
Thank you, Sherry. As Sherry said, today I'm going to talk about the textiles of the Southeast Indians. And if you're wondering why you haven't heard this topic before or know anything about the textiles of the people who lived here for thousands of years before the Europeans came, there's a sad reason for that, and that is that the climate of this area, being so wonderfully humid, does not help organic materials such as cloth, yarns, even wood that might have been used in tools. They don't survive well in the Southeast. But there are other ways of finding out what the archaeological context provides for textile information, and those are the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about mostly the textile artifacts from the prehistoric era. We'll talk a little bit about the historic era up to 1830 and the time of the removal, what is referred to as removal. We have some fairly old artifacts. The oldest artifacts of textiles in the Southeast are probably some impressions in clay floors in a cave in the northern part of Alabama. But we actually have some extremely old fabric. And this is a sample of a collection from Wendover in Florida, way down here, so about as far southeast as you can go and still be in North America. And this is actually cloth that is adhered to a femur, a leg bone, of a 69-year-old man, or 70-year-old man, that was found in a bog burial. And bog burial is a swampy area, a wet site that people were buried in about 6,000 years ago. That's called the Middle Archaic period of the Southeastern Indians. And what we learn from these 6,000-year-old textiles is that at this time and in that area, the people that lived there knew how to make yarn. They knew how to process the natural resources in their area, the plants in their areas to make yarn, and they made a type of fabric that we call twine fabric. That fabric is much different from what you and I are wearing today. This, what researchers call interlaced. If you're a weaver, you probably call it plain weave or tabby. But it's the fabric that I'm wearing that most of the men's shirts are that are here. It's a very plain weave, and it lends itself to mechanization. This is the fabric of the Southeast Indians, and it's found not only in the Southeast but all across North America and actually all across the world in very ancient sites. It is a very old method of making cloth, and one of the things that make it attractive for ancient civilizations is it requires few tools. You don't need a loom, you don't need shuttles, you don't need a lot of stuff that if you're a hunter-gatherer going from campsite to campsite during your year, it reduces the amount of stuff you've got to carry with you in order to produce the cloth that you need. Looking at 6,000-year-old samples of fabric might make you wonder, did these people, the Southeast Indians, did they develop these methods of spinning and making cloth, or did they bring it with them when they came to the Southeast? Irene Good, an archaeologist at Harvard, says that when the first residents of North America, when they came across Beringia, this area that is now underwater, this is present day, when they walked over from Siberia into Alaska, we believe they knew, one of the tools they brought with them was the knowledge of how to look at the plants on the landscape, figure out which of those plants would produce textile fibers. Not everything that looks like a textile fiber actually has the strength or the elasticity or the abrasion resistance in order to be made into cloth. They knew how to figure that out. They knew how to process those plant materials. They knew how to make yarn. They knew how to make cloth. And that process begins with, as I say, wandering the landscape and looking for the right plants. These sort of plants, we call them bast, B-A-S-T, bast fiber plants, grow all over the Southeast. They grow wild. This is milkweed, and you might think of it as a weed. It could also be your next blouse. The fibers are actually in the stem. And here you see a cross-section. This is actually from a flax plant. And the fibers are these little bundles. They look like little bundles. And they're right under the bark or the outer part of the plant. And they're around this woody core. So the Southeast Indians had a process, very much like the process that is used in modern times to create linen, to take the linen fibers out of the stem of the flax plant. They had figured out this complex process of separating those fibers away from the rest of that plant material. And that a big part of that process is allowing the plant material to rot away. Pounding, as it's described by early explorers, they would pound these stems and then leave them out. So you let the plant rot, and you come back to it and you pound it again. And that separates some of the plant off. If you're near a stream, ideally you would have it you could put it in the stream with a rock on it and let the water help wash some of this away. But every now and then you go back and you pound it some more, and you keep working on it until you've gotten rid of the plant material you don't want, and you've separated the fibers out into something that you can spin into yarn. And just to show you what that can look like, this is flax. And this is about the height of the flax plant. These fibers were in the stems of many plants. And this is what goes into making linen fabric, like I'm wearing. Probably many of us are wearing today. Very good in the summertime. It's also, this bast-type fiber is also incredibly strong. The fibers are very long. They're very strong. The yarn that's made from it's very strong, very abrasion resistant, lasts for years. This is not something you would have to replace quickly. That's why hemp ropes, hemp is another common bast material. Hemp ropes are so strong and have been used for centuries. It's an incredibly strong fiber. I'd like to show you, once you've processed that fiber and you've gotten rid of all the plant material you don't want, then you're able to spin yarn. And you may have seen spinning wheels and tools used to spin yarn. But basically, the process of spinning yarn is pulling out the right number of fibers and putting twist in it. And it is that simple. That is what spinning is. The spinning wheel is just a method of mechanizing putting the twist in, but the majority of human history, yarn has been spun on spindles, which is a stick with a whirl, and the whirl is just to make the stick go around. And we think a lot of the yarn here in the Southeast, because we don't find many whorls, we believe a lot of that yarn was produced by what's called thigh spinning. And that was a method of rolling the yarn on your thigh, which puts the twist in. And you would not have on a garment when you're doing that. You would need the friction of your skin. And in the nice moist South, that works really well. So now you've got yarn, and by this time they've invested months of the beating, rotting, getting the fiber ready, spinning the yarn, and then they make cloth. And this is an actual Southeast Indian cloth that was found in a burial in Tennessee, in a cave burial, rock shelter burial in Tennessee, and was actually published in 1896. So people, and particularly William Holmes, was like the founding father of writing about textiles of the Southeast Indians. We've been aware of them and writing about them for many, many years, but they are unfortunately still not common knowledge. And I believe that's to a large extent because they are so rarely found. We find, as archaeologists, we find a lot of pottery, we find a lot of stone tools, stone projectile points. So those are the things we write about. We can see them, we can analyze them. Textiles, it's much harder to get at that information, and I think we're really just getting started trying to look into these things that are a little more out of our reach. One of the things that, one of the sources of information are the early explorers that were here. This this drawing that I did is from a written description by Lepage du Prat, and he was a Frenchman that was in Louisiana in like the 1770s, and he was here for a long time. He wrote, he drew what he saw, and he was just fascinated by the Southeast Indians. He had so much respect for them and was so impressed by them, and he wrote extensively. And he provides us a lot of valuable information. And he described the way he saw women making cloth. And he described these two posts in the ground and a string tied between them and the cloth hanging down. And I believe, well, we know that by 1770 the Southeast Indians are sedentary. They're not moving. They're not hunter-gatherers so much anymore. They're not moving around. So what I believe he was describing excuse me, was what they were using at the time now that they were sedentary. But this sort of an arrangement, this string tied between two posts, could easily have been moved from site to site. If you were a hunter-gatherer, you'd just tie it between two trees. You'd find two trees that were close enough. You make your string extra long so it can be used at different sites, and you tie it up to whatever is available. It would have been very portable. You wouldn't have had to have moved a loom or a stand with you as you move across the landscape. And this is where we get most of our information about the prehistoric textiles. These are potsherds. The brown ones are potsherds. These white things next to them are casts that I made from pressing clay into the pottery surface, which gives you the positive image of what the fabric was like. What's really interesting, the cloth on the femur that I showed you earlier was from 6,000 years ago. This is from, let's see if I can see here, there, Hammond. That site, it's in the up near Fort Payne in the northeast part of Alabama. So a good ways away from Wendover, where that last one was. That's the same fabric. This is about 2,000 years ago, so this is about 4,000 years into the future from the Wendover site. They're still making this same fabric. This one down here, also the same fabric. It's from Beckham Village, this spot right here, just down the Tennessee River, Tombigbee River, from here, close to Jackson. And also the same fabric. This comes up another 1,000 years from this one. So over the landscape and over time, they continued to spin yarn and make this fabric. And as I said before, we see it across the Southeast and in many areas of North America. There's beautiful examples from the Northwest Coast Indians, and that's up in near Washington State and into Canada. They made the same fabric. And part of the reason we have so many pottery sherds with textiles on it, we believe, is because of a process they used to make very large pans. Pans that were this big, could have been larger, slightly smaller. But in this area, or down the last sample I showed you that was down in Clark County close to Jackson, there are saltwater seeps. They're called seeps. It's like an artesian well, only it's not what you imagine when you hear the term artesian, a beautiful fountain coming up. It's more salt water that seeps into the ground. And Native Americans knew that these existed, and they would travel to that area and fill up their large pans, let the water evaporate off, and would create their dietary salt. These salines, these salt seeps, have much higher salinity than if you were to just go down a few more miles to the coast. So you would get more salt from evaporating the salt water at these sites than if you traveled further. But we believe that the way they made these huge big pans is that they dug a shallow indention into the ground, pan-shaped. They put a piece of cloth in that mold they had just made, and then they pressed clay into that mold to form the pan. They could have left it to dry in that mold and used the fabric to raise the pot up, pull the fabric off the clay, carry the dried clay pot to the fire, and fired it, creating a large ceramic vessel. They could have then taken that fabric. For many years, we thought that this was the way they made salt pans, is what we call these large vessels. And we thought they were using fabric that was ready to be thrown away, fabric that was damaged. Sometimes you see damaged marks in the impression. We thought they were using recycling their cloth, but the woman you see in this photo is Ashley Dumas, who's an archaeologist and a professor at the University of West Alabama in Livingston. She studies salt production in the Southeast, and is the person that first told me about fabrics being impressed into pottery. And we were working on an experimentation project together, so I made this piece of cloth, which was a big enough square to make the pan. And we ended up making a couple of vessels with it, and realized after it sat in the rain, this cloth, it sat in an iron pot one time in a rainstorm. It went through my washing machine and dryer many, many times, that nothing was hurting this. And this is commercially spun hemp that I got at a craft store as my first experimentation. And commercially spun yarn is not the same quality as hand-spun yarn. Hand-spun, if you raise the fiber and you process it yourself and you spin it, that yarn is going to be much stronger and of a higher quality than yarn that goes through industrial machines. Industrial machines are going to break it up. The industry puts fibers through chemical baths in order to get rid of the dirt, the bugs, anything that might be stuck to the fiber. So the fibers that go through and come out of our industry are not just like the hand-spun fibers that the Southeast Indians would have been using. So we realized that nothing seemed to be hurting this, that you could make salt pans all day and wash it off and put it on. You know, if you were to have taken this off, put it down to make a salt pan, you could just wash it off and put it back on. So we no longer think that they were only recycling. They may have been doing some recycling. It takes a long time to make cloth. Why wouldn't you use it for as long as you could? But it wasn't the only cloth they were using in these processes. But before you think that all of the Southeast Indian cloth was simple, that they didn't do anything fancy or pretty, here's a couple of other examples. This impression from a sherd is from Wycliffe. up here in Kentucky and was part of a project by Penelope Drucker. And that's a name that is also one of the people in Textiles of Southeast Indians that's really provided us with a tremendous foundation. Her research has been is constantly referred to and has been some of the only reference material we had for many years. But this image, if you can see, this rounded shape, it's not that the fabric is out of shape or been torn or moved. That round shape was woven into the cloth, and there's a lot of detail which she was able to see in the sherd and describe in her research that isn't as clear as you would hope in this image. But they did make rounded diagrams in some things. And this is an actual piece of cloth that was found at Etowah, and Etowah is just across the Georgia state line. I can't quite see from here. I think I pointed to Etowah. Just into Georgia. And it is a complex piece that, as you can see, actually has a corner woven into it. And if anyone here makes bobbin lace and is familiar with the way bobbin lace is made today, some of these pieces from Etowah have very much that look of some of the handmade laces. A project I've been working on for the past year with the University of South Alabama has been to create clothing for life-size figures that are in dioramas in the new museum there on the campus, and I really hope you'll go to University of South Alabama and see their new museum. About the end of this year, it should be open. But at the point I was asked to help them with the clothing, I thought I knew a great deal about Southeast Indian textiles. I felt pretty good about being able to do this until I realized that what I knew a lot about was little pieces of cloth about this big and little pieces of yarn about this big, and not about the wardrobe that a Southeast Indian woman in particular would have worn. And we have to look, we don't have, in the archaeological context, we have not yet found whole bodies, like a skeleton in a burial that is fully dressed. We don't have that level of evidence yet. Hopefully we will one day, but we don't yet. What we do have is descriptions from some of the earliest explorers, and in this case from the DeSoto expedition. And the man we refer to as the Gentleman of Elvis, because although he left us a wonderful description of the DeSoto expedition, he did not leave us his name. We know he was from Elvis, so he's referred to as the Gentleman of Elvis. And he wrote that the tribute paid them by their Indians, which consists of maize, corn, and deer skins, and native blankets resembling shawls, some being made of the inner bark of trees, and some from a plant like daffodils, which when pounded remains like flax. The Indian women cover themselves with these blankets, draping one around themselves from the waist down and another over the shoulder with the right arm exposed or uncovered. And so this is the figure we refer to as the grandmother at the University of South Alabama. And she's actually, these figures were made by life cast. She's actually, the woman that made the cast is actually the wife of the chief of the Mowa group of Indians who are in the Mobile County area. But as you can see, what she is wearing is a rectangular piece of fabric wrapped around her, over her shoulder, and a rectangular piece of fabric wrapped around her waist as a skirt. And I believe this is for I believe this would have been a common wardrobe, a common outfit for the prehistoric Southeast Indian woman. This is more about her. These are the cloths she's wearing were based on these sherds. This is the lighter colored. And we know from flax processing that these bast-type fibers can be dyed by being left in the sun. So I've tried to show that idea of varying colors from different plants and from different processing. But these sherds from Beckham Village are reproduced here, and these shirts, this shirt from Beckham Village is the skirt. And there are an amazing number of shoes have been found in caves in Kentucky. We have limited shoe information across the Southeast, but there's been just a wonderful amount of prehistoric shoes found in caves in Kentucky. And this is a drawing by W.H. Holmes, who I mentioned earlier, and the shoes that I made for the grandmother from his drawing. And these shoes, assuming his drawing is accurate, and my interpretation of it is something close to what they would have had, and they were made very much like the cloth in their clothes is made. Some shoes, if you're familiar with prehistoric shoes, some shoes are made more like basketry. These are made more like cloth, more the process of cloth. The thing that I have found so interesting in looking at the Southeast Indian textiles is thinking about the point of contact. If we have interpreted the archaeological record accurately, then a Southeast Indian woman would have been wearing something like this. And this is Isabella, who sent Columbus out on his voyage. And you can see what she's wearing. Well, what's really interesting, in 1500, the foundation of the technology behind these two wardrobes is really the same. Isabella's fabric was hand spun. It would have been hand spun on a spindle. There might have been some spun on wheels, but when wheels first came out, in some countries their use was regulated. It was felt that the yarn spun on a spinning wheel was inferior to yarn spun on a spindle. So most likely the monarch, who's wearing the finest in the land, is wearing hand spun on a spindle fabric. It would have been hand woven on a loom. It would have been sewn with a needle and thread. Sewing machines were not invented until the Industrial Revolution. She's wearing completely handmade clothing, so is she. What I see is the difference between these two, the clothing on these two women, is how these groups have chosen to organize their societies. This woman made her garments herself, we believe. This woman, her garments came out of organized manufacture, not industrialization. They're 300 years away from industrialization. But her society has been organized to the point of craft specialization where they can produce so much more cloth than these people. But the person working at making that cloth, if you can imagine what their life was like, much different than this woman who we depict having a lovely life, sitting on a riverbank in Alabama, fixing to smoke the oysters she just caught. So societies choose, over many hundreds and thousands of years, societies choose how they want to clothe themselves and how they want to organize themselves in order to produce the goods, including the clothing that they want to have. And I think that is more the difference between these two wardrobes than the actual one's pretty and shiny and one's kind of plain. As we move more into the historic period and the period of contact, we are finding artifacts, and I've been told today we have quite a few more than I had realized. But this is a fairly recent find in northern Mississippi. And this is typically, if we are lucky enough to ever see an actual piece of cloth out of the South, this is about what you would see. And this artifact here is about this big. It's a tiny fragment. And this is cotton cloth. And this is, I know it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look very nice at all. But it's actually a piece of yarn, a bast fiber yarn. And these were found together in a really interesting find of a battle site. They were not found with a burial. They're not part of a burial. They appeared to be a cotton cloth bag with copper bells in it and this native cordage tied onto the bells. And that little bag was buried by itself. Someone working with a metal detector discovered it at this battle site. Nothing else around it, just this little bag with bells in it. And John Connolly at the Mississippi Department of Archives is looking at this site and evaluating and analyzing the site, and believes that it's possible that the owner of this bag with bells felt that this was a very important possession to him and was on his way into the battle, and he stopped and buried it to protect it and did not make it back to reclaim his treasured bag of bells. Also in the pre-removal area, this portrait is here at the archives, and it's really amazing. I wonder if when you first look at it, you got the same impression that I did, and that you looked at it and thought, this isn't an Indian, this is European. This appears to be European clothing, but it actually, once you look at the details of it, it's not. Look at the way this is. European men are men today. We don't have a garment that looks like this. This is wrapped around him, tied with a sash. It has like a little overcloak. But what looks European is his collar. It looks like a European shirt with a cravat of some sort. His cuffs look European. But the rest of him is the combination of things that the Southeast Indians created from the cloth and the garments that they traded from the Europeans, and they combined that with their own traditions. And you can see here on his legs these garters. And Lapage Duprat talks about the Natchez Indians in Louisiana making these garters, and that's the European word that we came up with, the garters from buffalo fiber. The buffalo has two coats. It has a long, hairy coat, and he has a very, very soft, almost cashmere-like undercoat. And they would spin that undercoat and make garments out of it. And one of the common garments that they talk about making, even for young children, were these garters that they would wear on their legs. And you can see on down his legs and his shoes, they're just amazing and wonderful. But this is a Creek Indian. And this is one of the ways they used the trade goods and combined them with their own traditions to create the garments that they wore prior to removal. This is just prior to removal because this is 1820s. And finally, this is also here at the archives, and I really hope you'll have time to look at it, and if not today, then hopefully another day. This is Osceola's garter. And if you're familiar with Osceola, who was, there are varying opinions on exactly who he was. It is said that he was a Creek Indian who moved down to Florida and became involved with the Seminoles. But at the time, in the early 1800s, when the state governments decided they wanted to move the Indians out of the southern states in order to have their land, and the federal government did nothing about it to stop it, Osceola was among the native group in Florida that tried to resist. In the end, he and other leaders of that group, he was not a chief. Sometimes he's referred to as a chief. He was not a chief, but he does appear to have been a popular leader. And he, along with other leaders of the Indians in Florida, were rounded up by the non-Indian forces and taken to South Carolina. Now I'm becoming sketchy on where he was taken. He was removed from Florida in anticipation of being moved completely out of the Southeast, but he was moved and held in custody in a fort, and he eventually died there before too long. And he died as a young man. He had some complications and died. His physician at the time was given some of his possessions. And one of them was this garter. It was a set of garters at one time. It's down to one now. And the direct descendant of that physician gave it to the archives here, and it's here and on display now. And along with a couple of professors at the textile sciences professors at the University of Alabama, when I was working on doing my graduate study there, we analyzed the garter and tried to determine more of as much of the information as we could about the methods of production and about the fibers in particular. This is how it was made. It's called oblique interlacement. If you look at the middle of it, it looks like a standard weave. If you look at the edges, as one thread comes through here and it's woven through, it turns and becomes part of the threads going in the other direction. Teenagers make friendship bracelets today out of the same technique. You can see white tray beads were woven in. The interesting thing, though, and the most important thing we could not get a clear answer on, but it is the fiber that the yarn was spun out of. I had hoped that we would be able to tell once we put a single fiber into a scanning electron microscope where you can look at it at this level of magnification, that we would look at it and say, this is buffalo fiber. It's recorded that buffalo fiber was very commonly used in the Southeast, but there are no remaining southeastern buffalo artifacts in the United States. There are two. They are both in Europe. If we could have shown conclusively that this was buffalo fiber, it would be just such a huge, important find for the United States, for the Southeast, for people studying Southeast Indians. But as you can see, this is the fiber from Osceola's garter. It has degraded to the point where you can't see these definitive little shapes, the scales on fiber. You could take your hair, one of your hairs, put it in a scanning electron microscope, and people who study those sort of things would say, human. Every type of animal that produces hair has a unique scale structure on those individual hair fibers. And this is a buffalo. This is a modern buffalo. You just can't see the scales on this textile for some reason, which is too bad. But regardless, it is still an extremely important artifact in that it was with Osceola in 1930, just before he died. It's the end of an era, as the Southeast Indians were forcibly removed from the Southeast, although many stayed. That's truly the end of an era, and this is a textile artifact that marks that. What I'd really like for you to take away from this today is the idea of what Southeast Indian may have worn, because it certainly isn't what we see on TV or in the movies. That's most typically the Southwestern Indians, and Southeast Indians were unique. They were unique in many ways, and one of those is the textiles that they made, the textiles that they wore, and the way they held on to those traditions for so very long. I'd also like for you to take away, this is a sherd that shows a very tiny, and this is very tiny sherd. It was about this big. This is a cast of it. The yarn in this is almost the size of sewing yarn. It's a little bit thicker than sewing yarn. It's extremely fine. It's a 2-ply yarn, and it is very consistent across this sherd. Southeast Indians spun beautiful, fine, consistent yarns, and they spun whatever yarn they needed for the project they were working on, because in the sherds, there's so many types of yarn, so many sizes of yarn. They were able to control their natural resources and create whatever they wanted, whatever they needed. And I'd also like for you to remember Osceola's garter and go take a look at it, because it really is truly amazing, a wonderful thing. I really appreciate your attention today. I'd like to take questions if you would like, but we have a microphone and you have to speak into the microphone for the camera. So if you have any questions, please do feel free. What? Thank you.
Okay, my question is, I think you referred to it as a BAST category.
B-A-S-T,
used.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence, and at what time period, that they were actually farming this rather than going out and gathering it?
That is an excellent question, and I believe that that's a really good point. Typically in many people, but in archaeology in particular, we don't like to take the absence of anything as being evidence. But we have found no evidence that they ever domesticated any animals, period, much less animals for textile, for fiber production. And we don't have any evidence they domesticated or ever used intensive agriculture to plant anything for textiles. And I think that is, there's important information in that absence, and that you're not going to produce a great deal of something if you don't practice intensive agriculture. They practice intensive agriculture for corn, for squash, and for beans. This was at the end of the prehistoric era, but they did embrace producing a lot of something for food. They don't appear to have ever, we haven't found any evidence that they ever embraced intensive agriculture or domestication of any kind in order to produce more textiles. And I think that's an important point.
I just wanted to know, the clothing, do we have any kind of indication on how they fastened those clothing on them?
We don't have, we haven't found or identified jewelry or any sort of an attached fastener. I believe what I've done for the museum at South Alabama is it's tied on with the upper tie is the tie that it was created on, that it was hanging from, and any additional ties are the ends of the yarns that went across it. So we don't have evidence of fasteners, no.
Yes, I was wondering, was there any seasonal difference? Could you tell, from north to south, or was the weave different or anything like that as far as the climate goes?
Oh, that's a really good point. I'd say no off the top of my head. And what I've attributed to climate differences north to south is more use of leather. We typically think of the farther you go along the eastern coastline, anyway, the farther north you get, that the more leather they wore, and that the farther south you come, there was a longer spring, fall, slightly warmer where you would want something, but not, because there was naked, and there's cloth, and there's leather as far as temperatures that you can control with the available materials. So as far as the weave goes, no, I haven't seen that. And we do see these twining structures all the way up the eastern seaboard. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes. When you show the picture of William McIntosh,
Yeah.
Hope I'm getting out here. I can't tell. And Osceola, you referred to buffalo fibers in the garter.
Yeah.
I just assume, that's. You mentioned trade. Well, obviously they traded with the Midwest. Is there reason to believe that there were somewhere in the Southeast?
Yeah, Buffalo were in the Southeast. Yeah.
As late as 1600s, 1800s. Because it's.
And now.
It wouldn't have kept very long, I guess. It must have been contemporary with the gentleman that you pictured.
Well, yeah, you would hope. His looked very nice, so it wouldn't look like it was that old, whereas Osceola's garter is clearly worn and deteriorating. But there were buffalo farther south than you would think. And I'm not a buffalo or an animal person expert, so I'd hate to give you too much information. But David Bushnell has written quite a bit about that. And so if you looked into him, it's very interesting to see how far buffalo used to come into the Southeast.
Did you weave the garments?
Yes, I did. It's been a fascinating project to work on at the museum because I started with something that's supposed to be the Woodland era, which is 2,000 years ago. And there's this grandmother, there's her granddaughter, there's a chief in the Mississippian period, so that comes up about 1,000 years. And then there's a French trader, he's in 1750, and I did the clothes for a African-American former slave at 1900. So it was about 2,000 years of textiles, and it's just been fascinating to get to live with that little part of the history of the Southeast and to think about the number of people that have been here, the traditions that they had, how those have been combined and chosen and let go over just the 2,000 years of people being in this part of the world. It's been very interesting. Yeah.
The impression that you have up there at the top, is that netted fabric?
That's a netting. Yeah, it's a netting, and it looks like, because you can see sort of where there's an overlay, like right here. We believe that and we being ceramicists that know more about pottery than I do, one of the ways of decorating pottery in the Southeast was to wrap things around a paddle or to carve things into a paddle, and you would slap that paddle around the pottery, and those are for various reasons. We don't know for sure. It could have been purely decoration. There could have been a desire to increase the friction of the pot so you didn't drop it. Some people believe it helped the clay hold together better, transferred heat better, but that was a common way of decorating pottery, was to wrap a paddle, slap the paddle on the pottery.
When you were talking about Macintosh, by the 1820s, did he not have a plantation and modern weaving tools or not?
I don't know, but there were. I don't know about him in particular, but there are. There's a recording of. I can't remember if it was. I think it was the Creeks, a group of women, of Creek women, and it might. Let's just say Southeastern women, Native American women, who had. Procured, they were raising cotton, they had procured cotton gins, and Eli Whitney did not invent the cotton gin, I want to say that. I meant to work that in. Anyway, the Southeast Indians had procured cotton gin and spinning wheels, hundreds of spinning wheels, and were taking the cotton from the ground to cloth that they were making for their own use, but also to sell. And at that time, prior to the Civil War, that was very unusual. The cotton raised in the South, the people involved in the cotton industry in the South, not the industry, in the cotton business in the South, they raised cotton, they ginned cotton, they shipped that cotton out. They were not making cloth, they were not making clothing here. It was all natural resources being shipped out, and then the finished products, we would buy our stuff back. But this one group of Indians, at least, were trying to move in a different direction and do the whole thing here. But that was before removal, and that I always wondered if that was one of the reasons for removal.
Do we have one more question? Okay, right here.
Yes, I only knew two people that was ever named after a drink. One of them's name was 2 Liter, and I said, "Why'd you call him 2 Liter?" And they said every time he comes to work, he brings a 2 liter Coke with him. And there was Osceola. Osceola was the name of a tea made by the Seminole Indians, and he loved that stuff. So every time you saw him, he was drinking Osceola tea. So that's how he came up with that name.
Oh, I wonder what that tea was like. Have you read anything about it? Do you have any idea? Or at least that one fellow thought it was wonderful. Very interesting. Oh, the black drink is. Oh, hopefully it wasn't the black drink. Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Ms. Spanos will be here for a few minutes if you would have any more questions for her. Also, she will have her artifacts or her reproductions for you to look at on the table here.
Just a couple.
Thank you so much for coming today.